Hello and welcome back to our study of the book of Mark. Today we wrap up the book with Mark chapter 16 verses 1 through 8. And Mark is bringing everything to a dramatic conclusion. This so-called Messiah, Jesus, has been abandoned by his disciples. He was condemned by the Jewish council. He was condemned by the Romans. He was beaten. He was mocked, and he was crucified. An unknown man carried his cross, someone who hadn't known Jesus before. His executioner confesses his identity, and one who condemned him asks for his body to bury him with honor. So let's read the ending of Mark 16 verses 1 through 8. It says, "When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so they might go anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, 'Who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb?' But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. 'Don't be alarmed,' he said. 'You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him? But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you.' Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid." Now you may be surprised that I ended here. Isn't there more? This is actually the original ending of the book of Mark. The two oldest and most reliable manuscripts of the gospel end here, and scholars generally agree that Mark ended his writing at verse 8. Also, some of the earliest translations of Mark into other languages end at verse 8. So we see that this was the original ending. Now, the longer ending that goes on in the NIV and in the King James Version and so forth, it was also written relatively early, but it's still likely an addition. And there's some linguistic clues and some style clues. For instance, Mark, he's referred to Mary Magdalene several times just as Mary Magdalene in the previous chapters. But then in this longer ending, he says Mary Magdalene, the one from whom he had cast out 7 demons, right? So he's adding something that he hadn't added several times before, and it seems weird because he didn't do qualifiers like that in his book. So the writing seems to have changed a little bit, and that's just an example for you. And why add something? Well, Mark ends very abruptly. It says, they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. And so the women don't see Jesus. Instead, they see an empty tomb and a young man, presumably an angel, who tells them to go tell the disciples that Jesus has risen. But the women are afraid, so they keep quiet. And the longer ending seems to be an attempt to sum things up and kind of like put a little bow on it rather than just leave the ending hanging. So the ending of Mark actually is one of the most discussed textual variants in New Testament scholarship. And so there's a lot of debate about how it actually ended, but most tend to agree that it ended in verse 8. But we should note that the longer ending of Mark 16 might not be original, but it was added very early on, and it's also consistent with the larger New Testament narrative. Everything in that second longer ending of Mark can be found somewhere else or is based on something else in the New Testament. So there's no reason to be upset about the variation. We don't need to ignore what the longer ending says. But if we want to hear the story exactly as Mark told it, we need to stop at verse 8. And this sudden ending seems to keep to Mark's style. He's been fast-paced from the beginning. He starts kind of abruptly, he changes scenes abruptly, and he does this fast-paced narrative that a lot of times leaves questions hanging in the air. And his ending is a cliffhanger. What happened? Is Jesus really alive? Did the women tell? Now, of course, the answer would have been known to the church. Yes, the women did tell. The readers are at a church in Rome that was founded because the disciples were convinced that Jesus had indeed risen from the dead, and they were testifying to that fact. So the readers knew the ending But the story is left with a cliffhanger, and it leaves questions hanging in the air. You see, Mark was writing to a church facing persecution, a church filled with fear. He has told a story of fearful disciples running from Jesus. He ends with even the faithful women who had stuck with him through all of the crucifixion. Now they are trembling in fear. You see, fear is a normal part of the gospel-centered life. And Mark is writing to encourage his church. Oh, the disciples, they said, we'll stay with you to the end, and they ran away. The women who did stay to the end, now they're afraid. Everybody deals with it. Fear is a normal part of the gospel-centered life. And all who will proclaim Jesus as the Messiah, as the true King, must overcome fear in one way or another. Everyone who will follow Jesus has to deal with the questions that Mark has brought up over and over again. As we follow Jesus, we need to deal with the question of who he is. Who is Jesus? What kind of Messiah is he? Is he the kind of Messiah we are expecting? Or is he the kind of Messiah God knows that we need? And then, will I have the courage to take up my cross and follow him? Because following him comes at a cost. We can be encouraged because we know that the disciples and the women who were struck with fear, that wasn't the end. They overcame their fear. And we can too. God bless you.